when you're working with the royal family, that pressure that you get as the protection officer, you're wearing so many different hats. You're representing so many different organizations. So when you talk about things going wrong, that actually has global connotations attached to it.
Welcome to the Circuit Magazine, the #1 source of information on protection matters, the industry-leading magazine for all security professionals who want to stay ahead of the game.
Do you have the right skill set to protect VVIPs? Do you even know what a VVIP is and the context in which wealthy, high visible, and high status principals need to be protected? This week, we're going to be talking with Simon Morgan, former royalty protection and founder of Trojan Consultancy. He is a great friend of the industry, and he's one of the first people that I actually got introduced to. So I'm here with John Moss, and together we're going to sort of explore this. John, can you explain why he's such a great friend of the industry?
More than just a great friend of the industry, we do have a genuine, real good friend of the Circuit Magazine joining us today. Simon's worked closely with us for a number of years, and anybody who is a regular reader of the magazine will see Simon's ad in there for Trojan going out every issue. He's been a long-term supporter of what we do, more than just financially, with advice and just being a good friend and very supportive.
He is, isn't he? And an excellent speaker. And obviously we see him on television sometimes. But the subject of VVIPs, why is that even a subject? Is it a subject because some people claim to be working with them and they're not? Is it a subject because a lot of people aspire to work for them? What is the problem that we're going to try to look at?
Well, I think it's more to try to open people's eyes up to the challenges of working with this type of client, this profile, and why we even bother to categorize it slightly different. A lot of people, I think this might be what you were alluding to, get caught up in the status of it. And some people might want to measure their worth and value by that of their principal status. But that's not what we're interested in today. It's more about the challenges, the different types of dynamic that you're going to face and that you're going to have to adapt to if you find yourself or aspire to work on a team with this type of client.
It is, isn't it? And of course, this whole series of podcasts, we're striving for thematic based, content and a how-to, rather than just a this is your life type of episode course, but more of a guide, some advice for the uninitiated and obviously those, long in their career.
Well, the real danger of doing an interview like this on a podcast like ours is not just to crack open a couple of wet ones and want to sit around and chat and catch up, and pick the brains and experience of somebody like Simon. And is to try to stay on topic, and as our good friend Elijah would say, in mine for jewels, right? We want to come out with some really good takeaways for the listeners.
Indeed, and of course, a very informal chat about everything would be absolutely possible with Simon. But we need to focus on this topic of the VVIP, and we're going to relate it back to you, the Circuit Magazine audience. So let's hear from Simon Morgan, founder, Trojan Consultancy, former royalty protection, on the topic of protecting VVIPs.
And now, let's meet one of the contributors to the Circuit Magazine.
Protecting wealthy, visible, high-status individuals. We're here with Simon Morgan, founder of Trojan Consultancy, former royalty protection, and actually the best person probably in the business right now to ask these questions. So it's a pleasure to have you on, Simon. I'm here with John Moss. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Yourselves?
Enjoying it? Really having a good time? With regards to wealthy, high visibility, high status individuals, a lot of people probably think, yeah, I've obviously served on a detail protecting them, but it's clearly not industry-wide where we want it to be. So I guess we'll do our 3 quick-fire questions. Simon, why is the industry not where it should be with regards to protecting these individuals?
I mean, that's probably the $1 million question, really. Where kind of are we, and what exposure do people have with regards to, people of wealth, visibility, and status, which is what we kind of have as that catch-all phrase at Trojan Consultancy. How do people get that exposure? How do people kind of learn from it? But yeah, I think it's kind of catch-all phrases, isn't it? Everybody talks about the ultra-high net worth. When I was at kind of Royalty, and obviously since I've been out, I see the terminology protecting the Queen kind of constantly, and it stems from kind of people like us, all the way through people who stood at a barrier at the Diamond Jubilee. So, it's identifying actually what that means, because, from a client's perspective, the reality is that they don't know.
Well, we'll get into that because, of course, the market, decides all or not, right? Because they might not actually look into what they're buying. Well, what about you? Where does your passion for this particular area of EP, sort of come from?
It comes from our time with the Royal Family. Ultimately, we take what we did as police protection officers, and now we deliver that back to the private sector. So that's where we want to continue that thread. We want to work with kind of clients who require our services. That's ultimately a big portion for us. We don't really do vanity projects. For us, it has to have the threat and risk, and whether that's kind of actual or perceived. But nonetheless, we don't do vanity projects. So it's working for clients who kind of need your services, but I think more importantly, value your services. Because if a client doesn't value what you do, then it's very much like pushing water uphill. You're just not going to get anywhere. No,
very good point. And often people seem to get this impression that you need a very visible and braggable client, whereas that's actually probably not the most fulfilling work. So for the uninitiated, those may be brand new in their career, or maybe they've been doing it for some time, but they haven't really ever looked after someone of high wealth, visibility, and status. What should they think about?
It's very much a kind of multifaceted role. When you're talking about people who, possibly kind of encapsulate all those 3 particular sectors, then, the big thing is, what footprint do these people actually have? Because, the way you operate can actually kind of adjust that footprint quite considerably. My big thing is always unsettling the environment. If you go into someone who has a very low footprint and you're providing that security kind of blanket by dealing with the planning phase and then taking it to kind of execution rather than just stumbling kind of out of an evening and kind of hoping for the best, then you're going to unsettle the environment quite significantly. That then draws attention to your principal, and that ultimate indirect of intelligence then leaks out into people who will start to create direct intelligence against your principal. So it's how you operate is actually kind of key to the security that you deliver to your client.
So Simon, looking at in particular VVIPs, we're talking people of status, the type of people who would perhaps have protection assigned to them if they didn't seek it out themselves. One of the things that is immediately apparent to me is the high profile nature of that work. Obviously, the clients themselves are high profile, and therefore, you come in and within that bubble. And therefore, when you work on a team like that, it's going to be more stressful. The expectations are going to be higher, and everything you do is going to be scrutinized. Mm-hmm. And there's so many examples out there. You don't need to go far, search into YouTube to see many examples of what have been deemed or labeled as security fails, like Prince Charles, Macron very recently, Bush and Reagan. Having worked on both sides of the fence, do you think that criticism is always fair?
It depends who the criticizer is. So, that you've got to kind of put that kind of into context, and certainly kind of in the current climate, it's very easy to stand back and kind of criticize when you don't actually know, what the bits were. And obviously the media as well adjust a lot of things, so that you show the footage that actually suits their rhetoric. So, as professionals, you have to look at things like that. That's where we ultimately get our learning from, because, we see things and think, oh, that wasn't kind of quite right. That could have gone better. That individual has done kind of the best they can. So, when you're looking at things like that, I think you have to put it very much in context, rather than ultimately just pointing the finger and saying that is a fail. You've got to look at it as a professional and think, right, is it a fail? And if it is, what are the learning points that we can kind of take back from it? Because that's ultimately how we develop. If we didn't learn from history, then obviously we would be kind of stepping out and failing every time in any case.
And, looking at your own experience, particularly your time on the royalty protection team, and I certainly don't want to imply that you made any mistakes, Simon, but I'm sure along the way within the team, you'll have had those moments where in the debriefs afterwards, there's been things that you wanted to change or improve for next time. How would you approach that, or how would the team go about making those improvements?
I mean, you always have that kind of hot debrief, very much after an event, or and after a movement. What went well and why, and kind of what didn't go so well, especially if you're in a context of a multiple days visit, for argument's sake, whereby you've got to kind of tidy things up a little bit. But yes, there is a formalized way of doing it, and that comes down to kind of training sometimes, whereby you'll address an incident and kind of go back and say, well, okay, if you stood there, then that kind of wouldn't have happened. If the barrier line hadn't finished there, then that wouldn't have happened if the cars had been kind of pulled forward. So you look at it, and that's what you create your frame of reference from, going kind of forward. But nobody kind of sits there and thinks, well, nothing kind of went wrong. There is always something that you can kind of look at and say, well, we need to do that kind of a little bit better. Hopefully, 9 times out of 10, it's on a minor stage. But when you're going back to working with the royal family, that pressure that you get as the protection officer, you're wearing so many different hats. You're representing so many different organizations. So when you talk about things going wrong, that actually has global connotations attached to it. You're representing royalty protection, Metropolitan Police Service. You're representing the Home Office. You're representing Her Majesty's Government, Her Majesty's Commonwealth, and every business that trades under a British flag that stands there and says we're as good as we are because we're British. Because of the nature of 24-hour kind of global media, as soon as something kind of happens, it is out there, and it is also out there not to be dragged back. So, you are very aware of all these things that are going on. And, you are looking to get it right every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, but I mean, that in itself brings a lot of pressure and stress, doesn't it? And we know that, when you ramp up the stress levels in those kind of environments, and the public eye is on you, you've really got to be on your game.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. And, what kind of, burnout's like, with regards to attention span and things like this. You do a royal walkabout that's probably maybe 10, 15 minutes, a couple of 100 yards. But, that is, you're putting your principle right in the public domain. They're out there pressing the flesh. And, and you are working hard for that 10, 15 minutes. Okay, that may have been 6 months in the planning for that 10, 15 minutes of kind of operational footwork. But, that is pressure cooker stuff, because that's what kind of everybody sees. That is somebody's moment of opportunity if you haven't put everything in place that you can to prevent that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what I want to talk about is the difference between being reactionary and being able to preempt incidents and then do as much as we can in the planning stage to offset that. But one of the difficulties with royalty protection in particular, and I'd like to hear your point of view on this, but as I see it, it's very difficult to affect the plans of these people, often perhaps to the degree that we would like to ensure their safety, because they are public figures at the end of the day.
To kind of, going back to royalty, you're part of a big mechanism kind of around the family. So, but as a protection officer, you do have lots of the final says. They fully understand why you're there, and you're there ultimately to preserve life, no matter what everything else goes on around. So they fully understand that, and they get kind of cradle to grave. When you're working with the royal household, they kind of fully understand kind of why you're there. So you actually do have a tremendous degree of latitude, when you are putting kind of plans together, to consider the other stakeholders, to consider crowd dynamics, and how you're going to get things kind of to work. But this is something that you have principals who are inadvertently signed up to it. When you kind of move across to the private sector, that is where I would say sometimes you can't adjust the principal's mindset, because to achieve some things, you've got to have a principal who is going to accept that you are going to want a planning phase, you are going to want a recce phase, and it's not a case of I need a CPO for kind of 4:00 this afternoon to kind of go out shopping. For us, that's not the kind of work that we'd get involved in any case. But we would have principals that are coming to visit to the UK. We have an itinerary to kind of work to. We will recce everything that we can in relation to that itinerary, and they fully expect that we have already been everywhere that they are now going to visit. But that is a big deal of acceptance on the principal side, to get that level of security that they have to sign up to the planning phase. It's not just an operational perspective.
Yeah. And you mentioned the royal household there, and that's something that we love talking about on this podcast as well. The whole kind of home office and tying everybody together and building relationships. So for you on royalty protection and in the royal household, who were the main stakeholders that you would want to prioritize relationship building with in order to get, these important messages across?
Again, it's at kind of different levels. So, yes, you have people that you'll be working with around private secretaries. They most probably are the portfolio holders of where you are going at kind of a certain time. Then you'll be working with other members of the royal household, such as their chauffeurs. So, that's kind of quite a pivotal part kind of to us. Then you'll be working with the event organizers themselves. Who are we going to see? What are we going to do? What are they looking to achieve? What, are we opening something, closing something? Are we going to visit a general area as part of Wales Week that the Prince of Wales used to do, or kind of Holyrood Week that the Queen would do? Then you kind of got to go into kind of law enforcement in your various particular areas and ascertain what assets they can give to you to support that operation as well, especially when policing budgets are so tight these days. So you're asking for something that ultimately that operational commander may not be able to give you at that time. You may need more people, you may need people to search, you may need firearms officers to provide a kind of an outer cordon and so on and so forth. So you do get into that process of negotiation. You do get into that process of compromise. But then you also bring it back to kind of ownership. Who's going to take ownership kind of this? And we were, fortunate as police officers to be able to steer people a lot of the time in the right direction because of our experience of doing it, and having, certainly when I joined, there was lots of experienced officers who'd been doing it for 10, kind of 15 years already. So, you kind of look to them as to how they worked with the other stakeholders and got everybody kind of aligned, even the people that, wanted something kind of totally different to you. But, for me, it's always negotiation. You've always got to accept a degree of compromise. And then you've always got to give people ownership, give people ownership of their event and kind of get them to be kind of part of it. Because certainly, as we know, at our level, we should be in the background. People come and see our kind of royal family from those days, or they come and see our principals kind of now. They don't come and see Simon Morgan and John Moss, do they? Nobody's really interested in us. So, for us, we've got to make sure that everything kind of is in place, that those principals can feel comfortable enough to go and do what they want to do.
Simon, it occurred to me because I like to relate things back to all flavors of listener to the podcast. And of course, there are people who have never worked with such principles, and they say, "Well, I really wish I could because it'd be a great feather in my cap," and so on. And then you mentioned giving people ownership of tasks, making them feel like they're part of a bigger picture. I want to better understand that, because I can imagine if you have a very unimportant comparatively principle, then one of your main challenges is people taking you seriously, people taking the visit seriously and listening. But if you have someone of great wealth, great status, and great visibility, is it not possible that they will get so starstruck that they may actually not do their job as well as you would have hoped? Does it go the other way?
Oh, very much so. People get kind of red carpet fever, and think kind of it's all about them, and and they do, shake hands with your principal, and clearly are completely overawed by the occasion, And again, you've got to look to identify this. This is why you engage with people. Certainly if we're talking about, walking the line at a film premiere or something like that, you'll identify kind of people that not necessarily going to kind of cause you problems, but could become problematic. And it's that kind of conversation piece, the ability to communicate, as we all know, is ultimately probably 95% of your work. It's not the kind of the hard skills that kind of we use on a day-to-day basis. It's the ability to communicate with people. And that's what you've got to do, as an advance officer. You've got to kind of, got to get in the crowd and get the mood for it. And, again, it is all about kind of taking ownership. And you do that by communicating with people. Yeah.
And Simon, I think I'm right in saying that I've heard you say in the past that you don't consider yourself to be a person who's naturally inclined towards empathy. Is that right? Is that fair to say? I mean, I've known you for a while, and I would describe you as perhaps stoic. But is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's I joined the police service back in '95. I was probationer, the same as everybody else, and then I went straight on the public order unit, the territorial support group. Very much frontline, in-your-face policing. Most probably not much empathy kind of within that role. Then I went over to SO19, and again, most probably even kind of less again because of the nature of the criminality that you're dealing with. And then you go to royalty, and they almost kind of start again to a certain extent. Yes, you've got the core skills that they want, but I always kind of say, 1 minute I was dealing with, working in the kind of the gutters of the capital, for want of a better word, and then you're at a dinner at kind of Mansion House with a member of the royal family. Kind of how much kind of difference can you possibly look to get? But the training process kind of strips that back and gets you to be more of a communicator. And again, bringing out that empathetic side, rather than just saying, well, this is going to happen because I want it to happen, because that's maybe what I'd become trained to do kind of over the years. This is what I would like to happen. What are your thoughts on how it would happen? Okay, yeah, I accept your thoughts, but kind of get back to how we kind of achieve this kind of together. And yeah, it was a complete different role, complete different mindset. But nonetheless, underneath is that ability to do the job when is required. Mm-hmm. So, it is a tremendous training process. And yeah, lots of people would say I'm probably not the most empathetic of people.
I was thinking about that. And I actually think if that is your natural style, then it can suit you quite well. And trying to be empathetic when you're not could be really messy as well. It could really backfire.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But again, this is why the course, going back to the kind of the course as it is, this is what they're looking to achieve. When I was being trained to be a protection officer, they know what they want. They kind of understand that, and they will keep on putting on the pressure. They'll keep on layering that training until they get you to where they want to be, especially if you've got the basic requirements that they need, then, they will keep on layering that training until they get the end product that they want.
Yeah. And look, I think there's a danger of, I seen operators who I would class as potentially being too empathetic, whereby they're so invested in the principle, and it comes out of a really good nature. They do their homework, they deeply researched, they follow everything, their social media footprints and everything. But if they are, inclined towards being a very empathetic person, then you can find yourself getting really caught up in taking on all of that pressure and strain of what is a very public life playing out in front of you.
Well, it is, and you've got to be, as we both know, very kind of turn on and offable. You've got to accept, certainly if you're on a bigger team, that when it's not your week on, not your day on, not your event, whatever the case may be, that principal will still go out and kind of work with another member of the team. You can't be the individual who says, well, if I'm not around, the principal kind of doesn't go out. Therefore, I must be in work kind of every day and doing this and doing that. You'll burn yourself out. You'll kind of cross the line as to whether, you're actually become more, which way to put it, you actually become, you'll think you're actually part of their life more than the role that you actually play. That, that's not to say you can't have those kind of conversation pieces, and that's not to say you can't be professional in the job that you do, but you have to know where the line in the sand is, and I think, we've both, for many years kind of been in the private sector, and I always say to people, it's kind of great, you'll go out to, a Michelin star restaurant tonight, then you'll go to the opera, you'll get dropped off in a Bentley, you'll hand over to somebody else, and then the following morning you'll, pick up the children from school, having a chat with the dads at the school gate, and the next meal you eat is a Nando's. So, you've got to be able to separate this. If you're the individual who's sitting there dwelling as to whether your principal has gone out because it's not your kind of week on, then ultimately you're on a bit of a rocky path forward, really.
So Simon, a bit of a tabloid-esque question, right? You see online a lot of people that seem to think, yes, I am as important as my principal, or at least that's the type of image they're putting out there, and we see it on Instagram quite a lot. But I thought, what about a useful question related to that? Are there things that you think you've learned from these people of great wealth and great status and great visibility? Not things that you want to share on Instagram, but perhaps something from your time working with them that you think, what, there's a thread here to being successful or to being, something special. Maybe we could put a positive spin on that.
I mean, very much so. You do watch how business people work. Because ultimately, I'm a business owner now and kind of running my own team and responsibilities. And you listen how people kind of got their wealth, how they generate their wealth, how they support their wealth. Because, you're fortunate enough at times to be within their circles when they're talking about things, So my understanding of how a business runs is now kind of far greater because of the people that you kind of associate with, because the people that you work with, and so you do take things kind of away kind of from that, as well as kind of how people conduct themselves, and what makes them a success. So, you do look at various different things that, different principles bring to that you can kind of draw out with them as well.
Yeah, Simon, just going back to skill set, particularly want to try to extract something here for our listeners, especially people who are new to the industry, looking to potentially get with a client of this kind of status. And I'm thinking about your time, again, back on the protection team when you will be recruiting new members. I don't know how heavily you were involved in that, but I'm sure as a team trying to incorporate new bodies, there would be particular skills, attributes that you would be looking out for. Is there anything that we can take from that would be useful to our listeners to, so that they can look at themselves and their own skill set and developing in this sort of way?
Okay. I mean, I always say kind of, protection is the thinking person's game. If you can't kind of walk and talk at the same time, then it's not really kind of for you. So, we talk about the hard skill sets, and 9 times out of 10, those can be taught. You can be taught to shoot, you can be taught to drive, you can be taught to fight. Okay, there's some element, there's that kind of 1% element that, some people kind of can't, but the majority of people can be taught those physical skills and create those kind of mindsets, certainly around a kind of conflict scenario. But if you cannot walk and talk at the same time, if you cannot think with the strategy of what if I do this now, what's going to be the result? If I do this now, what's going to be the result? If I don't do this now, what's going to be the result? And those take place kind of within kind of microseconds, and those are built up from your training and from your experience as well. But when we were looking to select protection officers, we used to kind of talk about the juggler scenario, whereby you've got two individuals who kind of can quite comfortably juggle 5 balls, and you throw them a 6th ball, and initially one kind of drops it and then the other one drops it, but the one that kind of dropped it first actually now starts to fall apart, and the 5th ball gets dropped and the 4th ball gets dropped, and they eventually go to pieces, as opposed to the individual who dropped that 6th ball, managed to steady himself, has now had that 6th ball put back in and is now carrying on. That is what we're looking for. We're looking for people who can see it for what it is, can deal with it, can prioritize, can stabilize their minds, and get back to where they need to be.
Yeah. So as it starts falling apart, don't fall apart with it. Stay strong.
Absolutely. Don't get that catastrophe syndrome whereby you keep on going down and down and down. There's a lot of psychology around it, and certainly a lot of sports psychology, which I did for my sports science degree many years ago. And a lot of high-end performers do not suffer from the catastrophe syndrome, whereby they just keep on going down and down and down. A lot of them have the kind of the U scenario, whereby they'll go down so far, but actually then they'll kind of bring themselves kind of back up, and you can see that in a lot of kind of high level athletes, certainly those that take part in kind of a team environment. Goalkeepers are one that I can remember doing a lot of work on when I was in university, and the ones that perform at the higher level, yes, they may let a goal in, but then they kind of pull it back, and after that, they have a tremendous game. The ones that aren't as successful and aren't as good are the ones that do let goal 3, 4, 5, and 6 in, and just completely kind of fall apart. So it's that kind of mindset that you kind of have to have, and not be able to kind of, if things are going badly around you, you don't really need to kind of contribute to the problem. You need to be kind of part of that solution.
Simon, I wanted to briefly bring up a subject that we have spoken about on this podcast recently, but with a different flair. So we've thought recently about standards, and we've thought recently about whether or not we have to make compulsory higher standards, because there are some people that will simply buy whatever's in the market without considering what they're buying. So buyer beware applies. And so we must raise the bottom and so on. Is VIP or VVIP protection excluded from that scenario? Because it seems to me that you're going to try and hire someone from royalty protection, or you're going to try and hire someone with, if you value it, SF background, or whatever you deem as very valuable. You're not going to be as a VVIP hiring from the bottom. So I'd be interested in your thoughts. Are we on a big mission to raise the standard, but not here because it's already very high?
I mean, clients of that nature know normally what they want. They've educated themselves. A lot of them may have been in and around security for many years, whether they kind of, cradle to grave, such as the royal family, or they've just been in and around it and now kind of adopted that themselves. So they will already know what they like and what they don't like. I think, the difficulty comes in where security becomes a requirement, such as for insurance, for argument's sake, whereby the only requirement is to be a holder of an SIA license. That's where that kind of education piece is needed, because, the client may very well be thinking they're getting James Bond, but the reality is they're getting Johnny English, because they don't know any better, because the standard that they've taken is that of the SIA license.
I love it. I love the Johnny English reference. I'd be perfectly happy with Johnny English. He'd be really funny.
He'll certainly amuse you over the course of the day, I'm sure.
You definitely have an in. No, but I like this, and I like how, okay, our listeners are not majorly from royalty protection, right? So they're looking up, they're saying, what can we do? And I think you've given a lot of great examples of whether or not a VVIP will hire someone who hasn't got that background. That's another story.
It is. It comes down to choice, doesn't it? It comes down to choice, and ultimately, sometimes it also comes down to cost. And then you come back away. So, okay, well, what price, peace of mind? For our principals, they sign up to, yes, the delivery standard, but they also sign up to the preparation standard. Lots of principals will say, well, no, I just want you kind of outside my house, kind of, at 4:00 in the afternoon, kind of in a suit, and we're off. Off where? Don't know. So, from that perspective, those aren't the kind of principles that we seek. And again, I suppose as we look at kind of our principles, like I said, earlier on, we have a criteria, and the first one is that there has to be threat and risk. If there's no threat and risk, why do it? Because we don't do vanity projects, but that threat and risk could be kind of actual, kind of all perceived. Will the client value what we do? Because again, if the client doesn't value what you do, then you're going to be on a pretty difficult day, because they might want to always do the opposite. They could be exposing themselves, kind of, and you, because as an employer, I have a duty of care to my officers that I put out with principals. And then finally, is the client prepared to pay for it? I put the financial things kind of last, because if the first two criteria are mixed, I'm not really fussed on whether the client can afford it or not, because they're most probably not the right client for us.
A very, very good note for everybody. I think that's good. And if you can't negotiate, if you can't determine your own terms, then it's not a business. It's something else. Yeah. I like it. All right. Well, Simon, this is very good. I realize there is an entire segment to be done on your entire career. I'm sure many books to be written.
Well, we've kept on talking about it. John and I have talked about it for years, but we've never kind of quite got around to it, have we? For a variety of different reasons. So, but
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, no, obviously there are things that will come out in the fullness of time in some sort of novel that you'll probably write or book or anything like that.
Oh, I've got an NDA about that kind of thick that, you sign the day you join, you kind of, you sign it every year, and then they give you another copy of it the day you leave. So, from that perspective, but that's more about the kind of the kiss and tell side of things, the operational side of things. A lot of it is in the public domain kind of already. So, really, you're not giving away any secrets. You're most probably just talking about kind of standards and how those standards kind of are achieved, to be honest with you. So, I'm kind of quite comfortable.
Was there anything that Netflix left on the table after they made The Crown?
See, I've never watched it, John. I've never watched it. I did the premiere for it a number of years ago when the first series came out. We did the Leicester Square premiere, and I've never watched it. And I I still don't think it's caught up to my time period when I was at Royalty. I think it's only just wandering towards that. So lots of things that the Crown has to dealt with was way before kind of my time. So, maybe when it gets to the era that I was there, I'll have a look at it, and say, oh, yeah, okay, well, that may have happened, it may not have happened, and so on and so forth. But so I've never watched it, so I can't comment. And they've certainly never asked me to kind of do any QA for it, which is a shame.
Well, I was just about to say, hopefully we'll get to see you on the TV again.
Maybe. So let's see what happens.
Perfect. All right. Well, this is making VVIPs accessible to the rest of the Circuit Magazine community, or at least giving us a very good idea how we might approach it if we got that work, and why we might want that work in the first place. As you pointed out, you want the right clients. Many places we could go, obviously some places we can't go, but I really valued this session. So Simon, thank you from John and myself. Thank you for being such a great guest on the Circuit Magazine podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Protecting VVIPs, Simon Morgan is the person to have on this podcast. I'm so glad we had him on. Obviously, so many more places we could have gone with the podcast, but I really enjoyed it. What about you, John?
Yeah, it was fantastic. Felt under an enormous weight of pressure to try to get as much out of Simon and satisfy our listeners. But it's very difficult. Like you say, there's so much that when you have, 40 minutes with somebody like Simon, it's never enough.
Indeed. And, I like actually the perspective that if you are not so empathetic and you do, maintain a level head, then these VVIPs can teach you a lot as well. Obviously, there are some standards that need to be, raised across the whole industry, but it's good to sort of hear that perhaps at that level, at least, smart decisions are being made about, selection, which I think is quite heartening. What else did you take away from today's session?
Well, just going back to that empathy point, I think there was more to it than just the actual, whether you are an empathetic person or not. Is what really spoke to me was the fact that Simon identified that early, and he used that in part to select his own career trajectory. And by understanding yourself and your own strengths and weaknesses, it will unlock the answers to where you should work, where you're well suited, where you might struggle and where you can be preemptive and either take courses, get advice, or just stay clear of that area. And I think there's so much more there that we can take away from that and learn and adopt that into our own principles.
And as he said, it's a thinking person's game. And if you're not going to get the clients that you're looking for, then you should walk away. Obviously, I know not everyone is in such a strong position, but I think that's at least another great sentiment. You should be prepared to not take on board a client that is not valuing what you do and not needing what you do. I think that's another good takeaway.
Yeah, and it's not that your standards need to be the same as Simon's, but what it should inform you is that knowing where your north pointer is and always staying true to that.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think we're going to definitely have Simon back on another podcast or event or another article in the magazine. Things coming up. Talking about events, we're going to be doing another Circuit Magazine event this time at mid-November. Just a save the date for you. Please do keep an eye out for it. And we're going to be actually looking at a topic that can span geographies. It's going to be something on the topic of workplace violence and its applicability to EP and the evolution of corporate security. I think we're going to reveal more details, but I want to get that in your calendars, at least as a sort of a rough save the date coming up. We've had a few guest speakers, Joe Saunders, on our podcast before, and I think the time is right to look at it. What do you think, John?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to do, not trying to push you into committing to anything live on air, but I think we're going to do something a little bit special that we haven't done before and try to make this stretch across quite a few time zones, right?
Indeed. Well, no, don't worry. I have no problem committing to it. I will put my pen to paper. It will be valid for the UK evening, the Pacific Coast afternoon, and the Australian morning, which in turn should help us really bring the community together. Sounds ambitious, but it will be accessible.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Just tell me what time I need to be out of bed.
Absolutely. Well, it's not going to be too bad for all involved, and it'll be a unifying topic, especially because I think after COVID, or at least towards the end of COVID, people are going to say, we've had a lot of responsibilities thrown on us. What do we want to keep? What do we not want to keep? Maybe some facilities management stuff we don't want to keep. Maybe some, things that perhaps we want concierge to do, maybe not. But workplace violence, I think we've got a special role to play. Anyway, we'll give you more of that as it develops. VVIP protection, obviously, a lot of people want to do it, but don't know why. Some people know why, but can't. So it's been perfect to have Simon Morgan on to lift the lid and explain to us what to do when you're in the position and how to go towards doing that role. Right. This has been another fantastic edition of the Circuit Magazine podcast, this week with a tremendous friend of the magazine and, of course, the industry, Simon Morgan. From John and myself, thank you very much.
You have been listening to the Circuit Magazine podcast. Be sure to subscribe and be sure to not miss an episode.